Hi, Clive. Welcome back to 10 by 6.
Hello, this threatening woman has just said we're being recorded.
Yeah, I think this is the third or the fourth opportunity we've had to chat. And this week, we're going to focus more on some of those interesting stories that I think you'd like to have maybe discussed beforehand, but we didn't have time. Whether it's to do with women on death row or whether it's to do with just peculiar cases that you've come across that maybe stand out a little bit from the others.
Oh, look, there are hundreds. I don't know, I could go on forever. So every case is peculiar in the sense that it's atypical and it's just unique. But there we go. Let's go ahead.
Yeah, cool. So in terms of women on death row, how do they experience it differently to men, if at all?
Well, I will say that when it comes to the death penalty and maybe prison, it's one of the few areas where chauvinism is good. Not, the very fact of chauvinism is not good, but because the legal system is innately sexist and genderist, it is much easier to get justice for women than it is for men. So you just look at the figures. There are 2,550 as of now people on death row in America, of whom 52 are women. And that tells you something. And it's not because actually women don't kill people. They do, sadly, but it's because the system treats them rather differently. And look, I've tried these cases with women, and it's people are just want to say, oh, little old lady couldn't possibly do that sort of nonsense. And in a way, however reprehensible those views may be, it works to the benefit of the prisoners.
Is there a similar situation? I mean, I don't know about obviously the numbers, but are there any females in Guantanamo?
No, that's all bearded men. Now, when you look at Guantanamo and the Euphrates, which is the equivalent, in Syria, the majority, well, there are roughly, depending on your estimate, a little over 70,000 people in those detention camps there. And the women outnumber the men vastly, but then the children outnumber the women. So you've got probably about, 60% of all the people there are children, and then 30% are women and 10% men. And that's a case where the tabloids have sort of tarred. I mean, it's one thing when the US opened Guantanamo Bay, at least it was, comprehensible that the 780 men there might be terrorists who were fighting in Afghanistan. It turned out to be monumentally wrong, but at least it was possible. When you come to the Guantanamo on the Euphrates, it's obviously impossible. I mean, the largest group by far are children, most of whom are infants, who in a civilized society we would presume conclusively to be innocent of anything, because they would be innocent. But instead, you have the British government is the worst. They're worse than the Americans by far, saying that these children should be kept in these awful camps because of the sins that are presumed upon their parents. And they're wrong about the parents and many times too, but they're certainly wrong about the children.
Why do you think that the likes of Priti Patel and repeated Home Secretaries in this country have taken the UK government to a much more extreme position than even the US?
Well, it's the politics of hatred, right? Each country has its hate groups. And in the US, we always had our hate group primarily to be young black men who we sentenced to death. We have other hate groups, but that was our number one. The Australians, intriguingly, make asylum seekers their number one hate group. And Priti Patel is sort of trying to catch up there. The British have had their own groups. We've been very hateful of immigrants for a long time. As if, it's always interesting to me when you think about the sheer numbers of asylum seekers. How many asylum seekers have you ever met?
Asylum seekers, I've known one fairly closely, but other than that, I don't wouldn't know them. They haven't expressed to me
Yeah.
that they're
I
seeking
mean,
asylum.
well, it's a very, very small number in the whole of Britain. And, it's sort of like hating the people on death row. You are more likely, according to Prince Charles, to meet a space alien than you are to meet someone on death row or an asylum seeker. There's 5% of the country think they've met a space alien. They're all obviously mad, but that includes our dear Prince. But there's such a tiny number of people who are asylum seekers in this country that the overwhelming majority have never met one. And yet we're encouraged by Priti Patel to hate them passionately, like they're destroying our country. And it's all about hatred. It's all about politicians, when faced with the difficult job of governing, say to themselves, well, we can either, do our job and work hard, and it won't be easy to create utopia, or otherwise we can just tell the people of Britain that if they hate a few asylum seekers, it's all their fault. If they want to get out of Europe, and we say everything is the fault of the Europeans, then that's a way of distracting the population from the truth, which is that these politicians are worthless. And that's what Priti Patel does. It's the politics of hatred, and it's one that I'm afraid I despise.
Yes. The two things come to me there. Firstly, you have to sympathize with a particular political ideology in order for you to follow through on that hate and division.
You really don't. I mean, there are people, I'm afraid, the level of hatred. If you want to talk about the people we really, really hate in Britain, who are they?
When you say we, you mean?
I mean, every British person, even the Guardian readers, hate them.
Brown terrorists. I mean, even the Guardian readers, that's pushing it, because where is the Guardian right now in terms of its stance on anything? But let's say the homeless, let's say rapists.
No, it's not them. It's not them. It's pedophiles. That's the group that everybody hates.
I was getting there.
Yeah, I'm glad you're getting there. But it's just so pathetic. I've represented a number of pedophiles, and it's always interesting to ask people, hey, who here would choose to be a pedophile? And of course, no one does. And of course, if we accept the term mental illness, which I don't really like, obviously someone who is a pedophile suffers from a disorder. It's not something they chose. And yet for us to hate them does two things. One is it reflects how pathetic we are. But second, it makes the world dangerous for children. Because one of the things that got me in New Orleans was when people would move into our neighborhood and they had to do that ridiculous thing of declaring that they're a sex offender in your neighborhood and sending you a postcard. What's that going to do? The first thing that happens is a bunch of vigilantes go around to their house and throw bricks through their window. That then drives those people underground. You will remember the News of the World, of course, didn't know the difference between a pedophile and a pediatrician. So they did that for some poor doctor in Wales. But what that does, if you are a pedophile, is drive you underground, get you away from the people who are trying to help you. And then you reoffend and some other poor child suffers. So those policies are so counterproductive as well as hateful that it's just very sad. And Priti Patel is the saddest of them all. I was chastised by someone recently when I tweeted some slightly rude tweet about Priti Patel, and I misspelt her name. And this woman got onto me, but she said she had a block on anything that mentions the name Priti Patel. She doesn't like it to come across her Twitter. And I'd somehow got around it by misspelling it. And she was very upset that I'd reminded her that Priti Patel exists.
How would you have dealt with, as a lawyer, how would you have dealt with somebody like, let's say, Jimmy Savile, if we'd had the death penalty in this country? What would your approach have been, or what would your philosophy be?
It's very hard to say, in the sense that I didn't know Jimmy Savile, and
fair enough.
If you just read the papers, you'll have a view about him. But the truth is, something's going on with someone like that. And in my experience, it takes a lot of work to figure those things out. One of the people I represented who was a notorious pedophile in America. It took me 10 years to get his trust enough that he would tell me what was really happening, to the best he could imagine it. And he wasn't very good at that either. So it's really hard. And I'm loath to judge people like Jimmy Savile based on what the papers publish.
Of course. I mean, and there's been a lot of speculation that someone like Jimmy Savile, for example, is the tip of the iceberg, but because he was so close to the establishment, and because so many people in and around the establishment possibly are, let's say, responsible for similar crimes.
Well, I wouldn't get into a massive conspiracy theory, but on the other hand, and I don't know enough about Jimmy Savile's background, that he didn't have the same as me, but I went to a school where my parents paid for all of us to be sexually abused. And, that was just the nature of private boarding schools. And, that's awful, right? And I'm not saying that it was systematic amongst all teachers. Of course it wasn't. But there were certain people who were attracted to that sort of job for their own reasons. And, that's really terribly sad. But the solution to that is not to hate everyone. The solution is to try to work out what's going on there. And no doubt, as with everyone, that, the people who did that, like most of my clients who became sex abusers, had obviously been abused. That's the cycle of violence, and it's tragic.
Do you ever consider how is it that you ended up, having been to a public school and experienced the things that you did, how you came to be where you are, yet a lot of your classmates, so to speak, ended up going in a completely different direction? And do you think it's in part, at least, as a result of the experiences that you had?
Oh, it's hugely as a result of my father being bipolar and being much hated. But also, the problem is this, and the charity that I've set up recently is about helping young people avoid the pressure of society to do something pointless with their lives. And one thing, unless you're my father who believed in reincarnation, is you've only got one chance in life, and you're going through it for the first time as a young person, whereas life has been around for a long time. And so I watched this so much in a very simple way with people in law school with me. When I started at Columbia, there were 313 people in the class, and a sizable minority wanted to go into human rightsy stuff. So, let's say there were 50 of them. And through the 3 years of law school, I watched them falling away. And it was largely because there were these pressures where first the law school had a student loan program where, you'd come out of law school with $100,000 in student loans and you had to pay them back. Well, that's an enormous pressure on these people to go and get a pointless corporate job. Then once they did go to a corporate law firm in the summer, the corporate law firm was all set up to give you great experiences in the summer because they were sucking you in. So you saw a side of it that just wasn't real. Then at the time, though, to fit in there, you had to wear the right suits, you had to go to the right restaurants and all that sort of thing. So you end up getting yourself into another structure of life that's very expensive. And then you're trying to buy a flat in New York or whatever, and you get a mortgage and whatever. And you get all these debts racked up, and you've now found yourself pushed into a lifestyle that you really didn't want to do. And I would see these friends of mine years later, and they're pretty unhappy, even though they were quite rich, because they had been osmotically forced into a life that they didn't want to do, that was complemented by fear of not having healthcare, fear of this, fear of that. And so they'd made all these dreadfully bad decisions. And that's what afflicts all young people at some level. And it's what we need to help them to avoid.
It sounds to me like a cage within a cage within a cage, and it doesn't matter where you are within society, you're trapped in.
Well, it's easy to keep out of it. You just need to know to. And I was terribly lucky because I was a young and naive and very stupid male. Maybe that's all redundant. I just have to say young male. And I was really lucky to have got out of that by various means. But it's quite simple looking back on it. There are decisions you can make that are actually very simple. And this is what we need to help the young people of today to do, because it's in our interest. We want these great young people to do fantastic things and not go work for some pointless corporation. And so that's the challenge now. I love doing it. It's great fun helping to coach people to do the right choices. I might be able to even rescue you. I don't know. I doubt it. It's hopeless, right? Is it a hopeless cause?
I'm 54, so I don't know what the strategies
you're
are.
A juvenile at heart, sure.
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
Next
Forever.
week, I'm going to be 62, going on 14.
Too right, definitely. And that's the attitude and the approach we should have. You've got an interesting, you mentioned to me before, you've got an interesting case around, if I use the trigger word, cunnilingus.
You would. No, look, I tell this story only because it amuses me, but also because this is the legal system that deals with my death row clients. And, it's not just the American system that's mad, the British one is too, but it was quite fun. I'll tell you the story just because you're a pervert and you want to hear it. It was one summer when I was working in Atlanta doing death cases, and I had some students and I wanted to keep them entertained. And I get this call from this guy, Jim Mosley, who was in prison doing 5 years at hard labor for what he said was consensual oral sex with his wife. And I said, yeah, pull the other one. But I went down to see him just because it was sort of too much to resist, right? And it turns out that Jim was a naval veteran who had been married to this woman who was having an affair with a lawyer. And she wanted to break up from Jim, but she wanted custody of the kids. And her boyfriend, the lawyer, said, well, if you get him arrested, you'll get custody. So she enticed him in for this last night of lust, where, she had him tie her up on the bed and do these heinous acts to her. And then she accused him of rape. But her sister came forward and said, it's all bullshit. This woman's just trying to get the kids. But in the meantime, Jim had confessed that he had indeed committed this heinous act. You call it cunnilingus. I called it tungalingus prohibitum, because it sounded like it was Latin. It was just something I'd made up, prohibited use of the tongue. And the prosecutors thought that was a real Latin phrase because I was a pompous English person. At any rate, Jim had been convicted on this. And, he told me that when he first went, he was sent to a maximum security prison. He was convicted of consensual oral sex, which was a criminal offense. Everything but the missionary position between consenting married adults was a criminal offense in Georgia. And the reason for that was that law was passed when, do you reckon? When did that law come into force?
1790.
1972. And the reason it was 1972 is in the 70s, the Equal Protection Clause said that you have to treat gay people the same as straight people. So the legislators in Georgia were confronted with the fact that they either had to legalize sodomy between gay people, God forbid, or they had to criminalize everything for everyone. And because, as Mark Twain said, 50% of Americans practice what they condemn and the other 50% condemn what they practice.
Brilliant.
And they're all hypocrites. They made it illegal for everyone, right? So that's why Jim was convicted of this vicious offense, because the jury didn't believe it was non-consensual, and no one believed that. But they did believe that he'd had oral sex with his soon-to-be ex-wife because he confessed to it. And so he's in prison, and he was telling me, the maximum security prison, this is qualified as a dreadful sex offense. And he said when he first got there and he said he was there for having oral sex with his wife, everyone laughed at him. So he just started admitting to murder because it was just less embarrassing. And it was actually very hard to talk to Jim without having dreadful puns. And I got through talking to him and I said, Jim, I'll get you off by the end of the day. So I went back to my office and I called Michael Bowers, who was then the Attorney General. And he ironically went down for a sex offense himself later. But anyway, it was Bowers versus Hardwick was the case in which the US Supreme Court had said that it was constitutional to criminalize this. So I told him, Michael, you won't find anyone who will take your position, so to speak, on this case. And he put the whole death squad on it, 6 lawyers on the death squad. And I knew them all quite well. And I knew that 2 of them were married heterosexual, 2 were unmarried heterosexual, and 2 were lesbian. And so, we had the whole lot, right? So then it was a matter of how hypocritical these people were going to be. So I moved to disqualify them unless they'd swear in public that they'd never committed this criminal offense themselves, which we got that on the front page of the Atlanta Constitution because, it's just the whole thing's silly, right? And you can't take these people seriously or they take themselves seriously. So then I sat around writing the brief where I called it Tunnelingus Prohibitum. I accused the state of cunning linguistics in their effort to justify this heinous crime. And then we had a protected First Amendment claim, which was that this was a protected form of oral expression under the First Amendment free speech. We had a section under the Eighth Amendment, which is proportionality, where interestingly, if you take necrophilia, bestiality, and public indecency and run all 3 of those offenses consecutive, you get more time in prison for doing it with your spouse in the privacy of your bedroom than you do if you do it with a dead horse in the middle of the courthouse square. And if you wait until your spouse is dead, it's just necrophilia, you get half as much time in prison as while he or she is still alive. So it went on and on and on like that. You could get 20 years for your first offense of oral sex. So we came to have a hearing and I wanted some expert witnesses. So I subpoenaed Kim Bassinger because she had given an interview in Red Book magazine where she was asked, she'd bought this little village in Georgia called Brazelton. And she'd asked why she'd bought it. Was it where she first kissed a boy if it was so romantic? And she said, no, that's where I first had oral sex. So I thought she'd be a good expert witness. But her lawyers moved to intervene and quash the subpoena because obviously she'd be confessing to a criminal offense and she has the right to remain silent. I got a sex therapist to come and testify about how experimenting with different forms of sexuality was good for people. But then we got to the question about, would you, doctor, tell people to do this? And he had to take the Fifth Amendment because that's solicitation to commit a felony. And all of this was in front of a judge who rather fancied himself. He was quite a nice chap. And he just took it in the right spirit. And he turned to Mary Beth Westmoreland, the prosecutor, and said, Ms. Westmoreland, would you like oral argument? And it just went on like that. And, yeah, we won. We got the case tossed out. And I like to say and claim that now, oral sex is legal for you in America. And it's thanks to me. I want you to know that. So I just want you to understand you have a lot to thank me for. But, the sad truth of this was that Jim ended up having a mental breakdown because he was an all-American guy who had fought for his country and for all things American. And he believed in the American way. And his whole world collapsed when this happened. And, I went from there. And of course, this statute was primarily aimed at gay people. And I ended up representing a number of gay guys who were done for that, including a British cameraman, photographer, who had taken pictures of himself in flagrante delicto. And they gave him 16 years in prison when they stole these pictures from his house. Someone did. And so, you know, this was just an incredibly pernicious thing. And while it was pretty funny as we were beating up on the government over it, nonetheless, it was a reflection of the deranged nature of the American legal system, which is a reflection of the deranged nature of the British system.
So is Georgia now?
Does me telling you the whole oral sex story make you happy?
Is Georgia now overturned? You're saying Georgia's now overturned the oral sex part?
No, the whole United States has now, because that case then went on. And then there was a case called Lawrence versus Texas, where finally the US Supreme Court overturned Bowers versus Hardwick and said, no, actually, you just can't criminalize that sort of thing.
Right. And in terms of your client, say he had a mental breakdown, what happened in relation to the custody of his children?
Well, I mean, by then, the trouble was he'd done a year in prison by the time we got him out. And, or maybe longer, I think it was 18 months. And it had totally ruined his life. And then he ended up having to get mental health treatment. And I don't know, I mean, he'd lost custody of the kids by then. And I don't know what became of them. That wasn't my, my area.
So there's that domino effect, isn't it? You know, on the one hand, you have a ridiculous piece of legislation, but then the impact of that piece of legislation goes all the way down the line, and it can be so ruinous.
Yeah.
It's a sad indictment. Thank you so much, Clive, for coming on Turn by Six again.
Very good. My pleasure.
Again, an absolute pleasure from our end as well, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Okay, very good. See you later. Bye.
Bye.